Hi, everyone. Welcome to the Unit 3 lecture. Today, we're going to be exploring how the sort of rise of colonialism, how the after effects of colonialism led to industrialization and led to a new sort of era of imperialism on a global scale. So, let's start with our course logistics as usual. A reminder, you do need to submit your Unit 3 reading reflections by the last day of the unit. Another reminder that, again, much like Unit 2, the readings for this unit do not completely follow numerical order. This time we are reading chapters 29, 31, 32, and 30. We read chapter 30 last unit because they fit together more, in my opinion. So this will be sort of the last unit where our chapters are not necessarily in numerical order. By now, you should have submitted at least one of your history and detail videos. So you guys need to get those in. Remember, a note on lectures. This is really synthesizing general information from each unit. It is compatible to what you're reading, but it is not comprehensive, and that you should use your lecture guides and your reading reflections to sort of grasp and get a overall understanding of the unit as a whole. So what does our agenda look like today? We are going to start with the Industrial Revolution, looking at how that came about. We're going to look at the fall of old empires while new empires rise. And then we are going to delve into World War I. So we are making significant progress moving from the 19th century into the 20th. So let's start with the rise of industrialization. So, up until the 19th century, much of the world, and we've sort of discussed this over the last two unit lectures, much of the world really focused on agricultural productivity, right? That was a key factor in China, in Japan, in the Americas as well. The majority of resources that European empires were acquiring from their colonies were agricultural in nature, right? They were looking for raw materials. And so that really serves as the foundation of the world economy, of local economies, et cetera. Now, this focus on agricultural productivity not only does it result in population growth, which can be both good and bad, but it also results on ecological harm, right? The more you focus on agriculture, the more trauma the land is going to experience, right? And the more difficulties those sort of natural resources are going to experience. So by the 19th century, in Britain specifically, the British government tries to solve these issues, right, of a intense population growth while also threatening agricultural sort of stability, and they turn to coal and industrialization. Now, what is industrialization? We are going to define it here as the transformation of an economy previously centered around agriculture, so what we've talked about in units prior, to one that is defined by industry and machine manufacturing that is reliant upon coal and petroleum to function, right? So it is shifting away from this idea of a very sort of agrarian, raw materials focus to one of factories, machines, manufacturing, using coal and petroleum to really churn out high amounts of goods that are range between sort of semi-finished to completely finished. So the Industrial Revolution really primarily takes place in Europe and the Americas. And why is that? Why is the Industrial Revolution not a global phenomenon? And that is because for centuries, Europe had really been using its American colonies to grow large volumes of raw materials. Remember in Unit 1, we talked about that triangular trade, right? The arrow going from the Americas to Europe was 100% raw materials. So European powers, Britain in particular, had really been using its American colonies to focus on those sort of raw items like cotton or tobacco. And after American independence, they continued to strike deals, right, between the United States to acquire those raw materials and to maintain that practice. Like I said, Europe and the Americas, they really maintain these critical trade relationships for cotton, sugar, and tobacco to make sure that this sort of process is continuous from the colonial period past the independence period. And at the same time, as Britain was receiving these sort of raw cotton materials, they had begun to slowly industrialize the cotton industry since the 17th century. So, although the Industrial Revolution really exploded in the 19th century, it was sort of a slow burn process that began in the 17th century, and each sort of aspect of industrialization built upon itself until we sort of get to the traditional industrial revolution. So, how did industrialization change society? Well, it relies on the factory system. No longer are people sort of scattered about in rural areas. Really, they are bringing all necessary machines, all necessary employees into a centralized location that results in the growth of urban populations. At the same time, because it is a factory system and the goal is to churn out as much product as possible, there are very harsh working conditions, right? There are generally 12 to 14-hour days for 6 days a week. There is no concept of labor rights or a 40-hour work week or a 2-day weekend, right? It is really sort of exploitation of labor to the fullest extent. And you can see here in this image here, this is an image from sort of a 19th century factory. You can see they're all lined up. They all have each of the employees have their sort of boxes of materials that they're working with, and they're really expected to be churning out at as high a volume as they possibly can. So as factories are growing, so are the companies that own them. And this results in sort of the growth of trusts and cartels that try to establish monopolies over a product. And a monopoly really is sort of like full control over a product or over an industry. And there are two ways to establish a monopoly. The first one we have is vertical organization. So a particular company will dominate all aspects of one particular industry, right? From sort of the parts manufacturing up until the final sale of the item. It is sort of the company's domain over each of those sort of beginning, middle, and end steps. Now, horizontal organization is different in that the company does not necessarily dominate each aspect of an industry, but rather dominates the same type of business by absorbing any other independent company, right? So it's sort of one aspect of that industry that a company dominates because it buys out any other company that tries to do that same thing. So, with sort of the establishment of monopolies, with the establishment of factory systems, there are a number of effects of industrialization that we see in everyday life, particularly on a global scale. That first one is going to be a sharp population growth in both Europe and the Americas, right? With the rise of industrialization, you're going to see the rise of urban centers. Cities are going to become bigger, factories are located in cities. Um, there's a need for more workers, et cetera, et cetera. So there's a sharp population growth. There's access to a more variety of goods because of that factory production that allows for a population growth. Now, at the same time, there is a decline in number of children per family. So, although the population is rising, the amount of children that one family has declines. And that is really because of that urban aspect of industrialization. No longer do families need a large amount of children to maintain farmlands, right? To maintain agricultural products, to maintain the land. Now, families are moving into urban settings. They're often living in very poor, cramped, sort of small settings, and they cannot feasibly sustain a large number of children per family. So you see that sort of child decline in one single family unit because of industrialization. Like I said, you see the growth of urban centers due to the nature of industrialization, due to the nature of sort of the factory system and centralizing goods. And you see the creation of the middle class. So there is, that rise with industrialization, there is sort of a much more of a clear establishment of a middling social class that is not necessarily destitute, but is not necessarily sort of the company owners that are making intense amounts of profits. They're really someone in the middle where they have to work, but they are still comfortable in their living. They are able to buy some luxury goods, et cetera. And that is because of sort of the rapid manufacturing, the access to new jobs that create that new social category. And at the same time, there is a very distinct sharpening of male and female spheres. Although men had traditionally, occupied the public sphere and women had occupied the private sphere, that will become a sharper division as we move into the industrial era. And finally, and we will see the effects of this a little bit at the end of this lecture, but also in our Unit 4 lecture, is the rise of socialism as a critique of industrialization. The plight of sort of the working class, the fight for the working man against sort of the oppressive capitalist owner, becomes a very important dialogue as industrialization expands and brings more and more laborers under that category. So let's pause here and do our first sort of engaging with the lecture question. Take a couple of minutes and answer this question. How did industrialization fundamentally reshape society? I'm going to pause here for 1 second. You should go ahead and hit pause in the video, answer that question, and come back whenever you're done. All right, so let's move on. So at the same time that the Western world is really booming with industry, the East is suffering intense social and political turmoil. And we began hitting upon that in Unit 2. So we saw sort of the decline and the destruction of the Safavid Empire. Now, what's happening with the Ottoman Empire? Although they are still standing by the 19th century, it has suffered major territorial losses. At the same time, economic decline has resulted in sort of cheaper manufactured goods coming in from Europe that flood local economies, right? So as these cheap, now industrially manufactured goods come in, the price is a lot cheaper than whether they would have been produced locally. So that floods the local economies. It results in sort of the destruction of local merchants, local tradesmen, et cetera, and that leads to an overall economic decline. While this is going on, with sort of growing relationships and trades, Europeans are coming into the East, and they, particularly throughout the Ottoman Empire, are establishing laws that exempt any Europeans in the Ottoman Empire from local Ottoman law. And what this is really used to do, it is used by businessmen to establish tax-exempt banks and businesses in the Ottoman Empire, but really are connected to European businesses. So it's not benefiting the local economy. It's really a tax-exempt haven for European businessmen to store their assets. So let's talk about Russia. So you can see here with this sort of graphic here, the levels of expansion by sort of beginning in 1533 and expanding further and further out until the 19th century. It has acquired such a large swath of territory. And by the 19th century, these Russian czars maintain a territory that stretches from Poland all the way to the Pacific Ocean. It is quite a large swath of land. Now, maintaining such a large amount of territory does not come without its problems. And particularly by the 19th century, social tensions from industrialization, remember that rise of socialism and new sort of political reforms that focus on the working man, leads to growing rebellion and resentment of the Russian Tsar's unilateral rule. So in 1905 to 1907, there are a number of revolts that severely weaken the Russian royal family. So this sort of acts as the beginning of the end of the Russian czars, and will result in the Russian Revolution in just a few short years. And we'll get back to that in a second. But let's go back to China. Remember the Qing dynasty in China? By the 19th century, they were having quite a lot of problems. Military defeats in conflicts with Europe really resulted in lopsided treaties that favored European powers who were seeking opium. Opium is a type of drug that was particularly popular as a sort of recreational drug in the 19th century. And it was very popular in Europe and it was grown in China. So European powers are trying to gain access to more and more opium to sort of, sate this increasing demand for the opium. At the same time, internal unrest results in a series of rebellions and reforms. In particular, in 1900, the Boxer Rebellion threatens to overtake the Chinese government, and it's really only stopped by a combined European and a Japanese force. So you can see in China as well, we've got sort of the Ottoman Empire, we've got Russia in sort of unstable, and we've got China as well facing a number of rebellions. So while industrialization is really boosting the economy in Western Europe and the Americas, in the eastern side of the world, in Asia, and sort of Eastern Europe, it is quite a different story. So, as this instability is happening in Asia, in the East, industrialization is booming in the Western world. Many Europeans see expansion as the only way to preserve their nation and their society. So that takes the form of imperialism. And imperialism is really defined as the domination by European, American, or Japanese powers over subject territories overseas. Now, this is often in Asia or Africa. There are three justifications for the growth of your imperialism in the 19th century. One, economic. So European governments are seeing overseas colonies as a new way to offer raw materials and options for migrants, right? The sort of original American colonies are now independent, but Europeans understood the value of having colonies to offer essentially sort of free raw materials. And so imperialism offers that opportunity to reinstate that dynamic again. Secondly, there are geopolitical advantages. Colonies offer strategic logistical locations, not only for sort of defense, but also for trade. And culturally, there was a very strong sort of European perspective that they need to quote unquote civilize other regions, that other regions were quote unquote less than, quote unquote uncivilized, and that European imperialism was quote unquote benevolent to civilize, these other regions that did not follow traditional Western culture. But how, as Europeans expand once more, how do they maintain control over their newly conquered territories? Industrialization. So remember, industrialization results in the massive sort of mass production of new goods and services that includes weapons. So advanced firearms are produced thanks to industrialization that give European armies a superior arsenal over the regions they are trying to colonize. So you can see here that industrialization builds upon this sort of history of colonialism, this history of imperialism, and allows European powers to establish new territories throughout the 19th century. Now, at the same time, new communications technologies like the telegraph allow for quicker coordination. So it is sort of a perfect storm between the events that are going on in Asia and the East and events that are going on in Europe that are allowing for these dynamics to build and shape, that gave Europeans the firearms, the communications, the context necessary to reestablish imperial control. Finally, we have steamships and railroads really expand sort of military and economic logistics, building into that idea that industrialization is the key factor for how Europeans maintains control over newly conquered territories. So what did imperialism look like in Asia? Well, primarily, the British Empire colonizes South and Southeast Asia. In India, British imperialism stems from pre-existing trade relationships with the East India Company, the EIC. As remember, we talked about the Mughal Empire last unit. As the Mughal Empire is weakened throughout sort of the 19th century, the EIC is really slowly conquering regions of that former empire. And that is because there was this idea known as the doctrine of lapse. And that was defined as if the ruler of an Indian territory, so if a Mughal ruler did not produce a male heir, the region automatically transferred to the EIC's power. So essentially, if a local ruler was not able to produce a male heir, this foreign company took over the land. And in 1858, that rule that had previously been sort of coordinated by the East India Company transfers directly to the British Crown, and India is ruled by British Parliament until 1947. Now, what did it look like in Africa? Well, between 1875 and 1900, European control of Africa exploded. Now, why is that? There was the sort of popularization of exploration books, right? People who explored the continent, wrote about their experiences, published them, then the public read about them. And this really piques interest in the continent's resources. So, although Britain does sort of establish and retain colonies in Africa, the French, the Spanish, the German, the Belgian, Italian, and Portuguese also have holdings in Africa. So it is essentially every European power manages to gain a hold of a portion of Africa to establish imperialist colonies. And there are both sort of corporate and government rules that are aimed at extracting resources from mining, agriculture, and the construction of the railroads. I would recommend reading the book Heart of Darkness by Joseph Conrad. It really sort of touches on the experience of European imperialism in Africa, and offers a very sort of poignant insight into what that rule actually looked like, and sort of the violence and hostility of European imperialism in Africa in the 19th century. So what's going on in America, though? If Europe is sort of establishing imperial colonies in Asia and Africa, what's going on in America? Well, in the United States, as they're sort of growing into an independent nation, they're like, hey, like we want to get in on the imperialist game as well. As a new nation, the United States government really saw imperialism as a way to demonstrate that they were a sort of uh, legitimate power on the global stage. So in 1823, the United States issues the Monroe Doctrine, and this warns European nations that they are not allowed to get involved in any issues in the Western Hemisphere. So that means sort of North America, Central America, South America, or face US retaliation. And what this really does, although it is not necessarily enforceable at the time that it's issued, what it really does is it becomes an excuse for the US to establish control and acquire territories in Cuba, Puerto Rico, and Panama as they sort of establish control to quote unquote protect these areas from European influence. So the aftermath of European and American imperialism results in several economic, social, and political changes on a global scale. Global trade explodes throughout the 19th and 20th centuries, and obviously it does benefit the colonizers, right? That will be European powers, that will be the United States, who are sort of forcibly removing raw materials to then be manufactured, produced, and turned into finished goods to be sold. At the same time, there are mass migration patterns throughout Europe and Asia, leading to a large shift in sort of demographics in all three of these territories. And perhaps most prominently, there is the rise, and like I said, it's both voluntary free versus indentured. And there's also the rise of sort of scientific racism. And it is sort of based on the idea that there is a scientific superiority of Europeans based on their skin color, their skull shape, and other physical characteristics. This will ultimately turn into eugenics in the 20th century, in which racism is essentially quantified and medical descriptions, factors, etc., are used to establish racist infrastructures and maintain sort of a system of oppression, both in Europe and America as well. So, throughout the 19th century, early 20th century, the world is becoming more interconnected with global trade, with European imperialism, with American imperialism, mass migration patterns. And so tensions in Europe are intensifying. There are growing nationalist sentiments with this sort of rise in migration from Africa and from Asia into Europe as part of that sort of imperialist dynamic. There are national sentiments, there are ethnic resentments, and there are economic side effects of colonial rivalries that result in the imbalance of power. So between 1871 and 1914, European powers are sort of increasingly trying to find alliances with each other to maintain a level of stability against sort of their allies, their enemies, other powers in Europe. So there are two hostile alliances that we need to talk about. The first one is going to be the Allied powers. That's France, Britain, and Russia, among others. And then we have the Central powers. That's going to be Germany, Austria Hungary, and Bulgaria, among others as well. So, as Europe is becoming increasingly divided, as these alliances are sort of solidifying, as tensions are rising, there's sort of one key event that acts as a catalyst for the outbreak of World War. And that is on June 28th, 1914, Serbian Gavrilo Princip assassinates the Archduke Franz Ferdinand of Austria. Now, in response, Austria targets a Serbian terrorist group, and it demands that the Serbian government allow Austrian officials to participate in any investigation they may conduct into the assassination. So essentially, Austria is stating because the assassin was Serbian, that Austria has the right to intervene in any Serbian investigation. Now, Serbia says no. And because of this, Austria declares war. Russia comes to the aid of Serbia. Remember, we have those two alliances. So Russia comes to the aid of Serbia. Ultimatums are issued to the Allied powers, and war ultimately breaks out between those Allied powers and those Central powers. Very quickly, a large amount of soldiers join the fight. So in 1914, 20 million soldiers joined war, believing it to be sort of a quick fight in and out. However, it really quickly turns into a stalemate that is characterized by trench warfare. Now, what is trench warfare? That is really armed forces attacking and counterattacking from a semi-permanent system of trenches due to the innovation of sort of machine guns and rapid fire artillery. So I'm sure you have all seen a World War I movie in which trench warfare is taking place, but it is that whole like two mazes of trenches facing each other, right? There's no man's land, there's barbed wire. It looks very desolate. People are popping up, shooting at each other, popping back down. They're not able to really escape or face attack from the other side. And it really becomes a stalemate. No one makes any advance, no one makes any progress. Really, it is a true sort of stalemate, stuck shooting at each other. By the end of the war, the total military and civilian casualties are going to be 40 million. So it is quite high. And World War II is defined by a high amount of violence. So how does the end of the world come about? Well, the World War I lasts from 1914 to 1918, and the end of the war is due to several factors. One, we have the Russian Revolution. I mentioned earlier in this lecture, 1905 to 1907, there were a series of revolts in Russia. I mentioned earlier the rise of socialism because of industrialization. Well, both of those things come to a head with the Russian Revolution, and the socialist Bolshevik government overthrows the Russian royal family, and it ends Russian participation in World War II. So Russia, a key player, is out. In 1917, the United States enters the war on the side of the Allies. That adds a new power, that adds a new dynamic. And finally, the high death rate really takes a toll on the fronts for both sides. Both sides are just hemorrhaging soldiers because of this very high death rate. So finally, the Treaty of Versailles officially ends the war with heavy sanctions on Germany. So let's talk about what happened at the Treaty of Versailles. Now, the Treaty of Versailles is signed at the Paris Peace Conference, and it forbids Central Powers from participating. So it is only Allied powers, right? Britain, France, now the United States, against, you know, Germany, Austria-Hungary, etc. But one half of the conflict is not invited to this conference. So this results in extremely harsh consequences that would later serve as a cause for World War II. Now, Woodrow Wilson creates the League of Nations, and it is considered the first permanent international security organization whose goal is to maintain world peace. Excuse me. Now, the League of Nations will not be able to stop the rise of World War II. And World War I really weakens Europe as a whole, and it lays the groundwork for the collapse of European empires after World War II and for growing resentment from Central Powers as we inch toward World War II. So let's come to our second question for the day. Go ahead and pause and answer. How did new forms of violence and warfare impact the trajectory of World War II? I will pause for a couple seconds here, pause the video, and come back when you're done. All right, so let's move on to our main takeaways for today. So, the 19th century really witnesses a shift in power dynamics as industrialization pushes Europe forward, while imperial decline left Asia open to colonization. We see with the rise of industrialization in Europe and in the Americas, it gives them that infrastructure, that access to advanced weapons that allows them to really take advantage of the decline in Asia and the instability in Africa to establish colonization. The Industrial Revolution, in addition to allowing them to sort of take advantage of decline, fundamentally reshapes Western economies, societies, and politics. And finally, World War II witnesses the highest death rates and results in a lopsided peace negotiation that will ultimately serve as a catalyst for World War II, as we will see in our next and final lecture in Unit 4. Remember, you guys do need to complete all other aspects of Unit 3, get those submitted. I look forward to reading all of them. Enjoy the rest of your day and enjoy the rest of this unit.